Welcome to Anthrop Dish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. Here in Canada, we have a lot of room for improvement when it comes to school nutrition programs, in that we're the only G7 country to not have any form of national school nutrition program at the time of this episode airing. And while they're not necessarily perfect programs, they can inform how we make sense of being a teenager in the world today. My guest today, Sarah Oresnik, is here to explore this more fully from a UK context. Sarah is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at McMaster University. Their research interests center around food insecurity and its impact on our health and well-being. Within their PhD, their focus is on how youth navigate food insecurity, looking at youth experiences particularly in Southampton, UK. Sarah grew up in the kitchen, learning recipes from their parents and grandparents, which is translated to their continued investigations and reflections on their own food environment. When they're not writing, they enjoy reading, photography, and rowing. I'm also going to be a bit embarrassing and say that I'm particularly honored to have Sarah on the show, as I first met them when they were an undergrad field student at the UNB Bioarchaeology Field School that I worked at many, many years ago out at the Fortress of Louisbourg. There's also an episode with Dr. Amy Scott on that one, which I've linked for your interest. Getting to interview Sarah on their PhD work feels like a really cool full circle moment. So I'm sorry, Sarah, if you're listening, but I just wanted to put it on blast that I'm really happy to see you thriving as a researcher now. In our conversation, Sarah shares about their current research working with teens in the UK to explore the merits and challenges of their school nutrition programs. They highlight the limitations of daily food allowances and electronic payment options, the impacts that food insecurity and cultural experiences have on shaping food preferences and values, and they do a brilliant deep dive challenging the very idea of what cultural foods, quote unquote, can mean for teens in a diasporic setting. Here's my conversation with Sarah. Right, welcome to the show, Sarah. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm so thrilled to have you here. For people that are tuning in, Sarah and I went to McMaster University together and kind of overlap for a little bit, so it's like an extra special treat to have you on the show to talk about your work. Do you mind sharing a little background about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is also Sarah. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at McMaster University, so located in Hamilton, Ontario. I do come, though, from Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory. That is where I call home right now. And so, yeah, used to the cold winters. And the type of work that I do is I classify myself as like a biocultural anthropologist. I'm really interested in how our food environments on a very looking at kind of all aspects of that, the physical space, what's available, cost of food, everything that kind of impacts how we access food, and in particular food insecurity, how that really impacts kind of health and well-being.
So I'm curious how you got into your PhD research topic in particular, because I know when we kind of overlapped and you're working on your master's, you're working in a bit of a different category and you've moved into looking at adolescent food behaviors in the UK. So what brought you to this specific time, place, and type of project?
Yeah, so my master's research was, I focused still with food insecurity, but I looked at pregnancy health, and I looked at that specifically looking at the interactions between pregnancy health, gestational diabetes, and mental health conditions and food insecurity. So looking to see kind of how those all intersected and how possibly one condition impacted another or increased risk. So yeah, food insecurity has kind of always been the constant thread that's I find has been kind of pulling through my research. Switching to adolescence for my PhD, I think part of that mostly came from being interested in free school meals. Canada's the only G7 country that doesn't have a school food program at all, which is also what led my work for my PhD to go to the UK, where they do have a school food program. So I think that was what I was really interested in. And I find that going through the literature as well and just looking at past research that there isn't a lot of research that's done on teenagers, on adolescents, on youth. Like we have a ton of research on what happens with children, and then we have a bunch on adults, but like there's this kind of gap in the literature. And after doing my research and doing my fieldwork, I understand why. It is complicated, it is messy, but there's also so much there, and it's such a rich demographic to get to work with. And they have so many insights that the more I work with them, I feel that I'm like ending every talk about my work going, we need to listen to what they're saying. Like we need to understand their experiences. So yeah, it was kind of school food that led me into this, and then getting to work with them and just seeing like their experiences and how passionately they speak about some of these issues was really something that has, I guess, settled me in this population for the time being. Yeah. But yeah, food insecurity has always been kind of the big driving factor there.
That's awesome. And like I was thinking about that the other day because my daughter, we're watching some of those like classic Disney coming of age films. And so she was asking, well, why are all of these things saying coming of age? Like, what is that? And it strikes me in your research and what you're speaking about just now, too, that there is this gap during a time that is so fundamental to so many people in terms of, how they position themselves in the world and where they're going. Can you speak a little bit to how food plays into, some of these experiences and transitions that the adolescents that you're working with face generally?
Yeah. So I think the first kind of big change that they have is that they have a lot more agency. And we all experience this as we grow up. We're no longer necessarily tied to our parents' hips, especially we just have freedom to move around our neighborhoods, our communities, our cities a lot more. And also, you end up with pocket change if it's through like working a part-time job or allowance or whatever it is. So you have a little bit of monetary freedom and you have more agency. And so just there from the get-go, you've got a little bit more say in what you're doing. You've got the ability to stop and buy food either on the way to or from school, like get yourself a snack that isn't available at home. You might also, as you get older, just have a little bit more of a voice of saying, oh, I want these foods in the house. This is what I want for dinner. So those are kind of some of the big changes I think is just that we see with kind of teenagers and adolescents in general is just having more of choice and having more say. And that's not to say that children don't have any sway over what gets put into a grocery cart or what food they get
Yeah.
to snack on at home, but it's gives you a chance, I think, to like really explore different tastes as well. Like if you grow up in a household that doesn't explore certain cuisines or different flavors, suddenly you go out for like a quick meal with your friends, and that might be something that you get to try for the first time. So I think that's kind of, you get a little bit more freedom in what foods you're looking at to have kind of outside of home and also outside of, especially in the UK, what foods are available at school.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember that being such a like hugely important period of time for my own relationships with food because as you said, there's so much more agency and being able to have like I skip school to go for lunch with my friends, which is maybe not recommended. But those are those moments that really start to give you a sense of like who you are, who you're going to become. And it's really powerful. So it's exciting to see how you're exploring that through the research too. Can you kind of set the landscape for your, where you're doing your research?
Is Southampton. So for those who aren't geographically familiar with the UK, and my geography there is not perfect either. I've gotten a lot better at the area around Southampton. So it's about 2 hours-ish, depending on how long your bus ride is, southwest of London. And what it's probably most known for is actually it is the port in which the Titanic left from. So
Oh, cool.
yeah, that's what, like, if people recognize the city name Southampton when I'm speaking to them about my research, it's always, was that where the Titanic left? And I was like, yes, that's
Sweet.
it. So it's a port city. So it was very much like a place for global trade and whatnot. And kind of grew up as a bit of an industrial city, but now it's quite a diverse city, I find, living there. And so it's got quite a large university population. It's got a couple like research intensive universities there, as well as kind of some tech industries that are coming up as well. So I found that it was quite a diverse city, and like all cities, we see different neighborhoods with different socio-demographic backgrounds and socioeconomic status. So you've got some poor neighborhoods that definitely have higher levels of kind of immigrants, and then you also have like very wealthy neighborhoods where you don't really see that disparity as much. I found it was honestly fairly similar. Like I felt fairly comfortable being in that city. It felt somewhat akin to Hamilton in a way.
Yeah, I could see that.
And and I found that Hamilton was a similar transition from Winnipeg. So I don't know how I
Yeah.
keep finding cities that just kind of, I'm like, okay, I'm used to this. It's yeah, so it's definitely is multicultural city. It's got a lot of different industries going on, and yeah, a lot of university students as well. Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I could definitely see from what you're saying the similarities with Hamilton too. I'm curious, so you mentioned that in the UK that there's school lunch programs. Obviously in Canada, as you said, we don't have that currently. What does the school food lunch program look like in the UK? And like how long has it been around and what are students afforded through that program?
I can give a real history lesson here. All the history that I always have to cut out of presentations. Yeah, the UK food program has quite a large history. So it goes back to when education became compulsory, which I want to say was 1940. 1902. Don't necessarily quote me on that year specifically, but it was when basically children had to stay in school. They were no longer allowed to be working at home and be like bringing in income for the family. So any child past the age of 10 had to be in school. And so you've got a large population of children that used to be at home working and bringing income into the family that are now at school, not bringing in that income. And you actually see that there's a lot of really hungry kids. And so you're seeing them all in one place. And so it started as I find that a lot of school programs have, if you're looking into their history, is it started with charity groups. And one thing that I always like to highlight is that it was predominantly women that were doing all of this work and just making meals and bringing them to schools and providing children with meals at school. And it wasn't until I believe it was the Education Act in 1906 that it officially providing food at school became something that they had to be doing. Yeah, so that was kind of a huge shift there. And yeah, I always like to highlight the fact that women were the driving force behind that because they weren't obviously allowed in parliament at the time. So they weren't part of those groups, but they were the driving force and they were really the voices pushing for that change. So yeah, I find that looking at the history of the UK school food program is so interesting because it's been influenced by so many different variables over time. So another big one is that they were also just looking at kind of nourishment of children, in part because they were trying to build a strong labor force, as well as kind of having people that could actually enlist. So when they were looking at getting people into the Boer War, they had a lot of people that like weren't like nourished enough throughout their childhood to actually like be fit to be sent off.
Whoa.
So yeah, it's just like one. So there's all these political, and this is why I love looking into kind of school food because it's this real nexus where you've got political, economic, and kind of social ideas and values all kind of intersecting. So that was kind of part of the reasoning behind also offering these meals was not just to feed kids, but then you're thinking about these children become your workforce later on. So that was a big part of that. Yeah. And so, yeah, that was kind of a big shift. School meals were allowed. As we kind of shift through, also just at the end of World War II, obviously free school meals were huge during the war as well, just kind of keeping kids fed, especially at times of rations. But I believe it was 1944 when then milk was required for all kids at school. The UK is a big dairy country. And I think it's one of those things as well where a lot of us grew up with milk. There's no formal food programs in Canada, but I grew up with a milk program in my school.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah. I forgot about that one.
Yeah, they would come around and if your parents had prepaid, you got a carton of milk. So yeah, milk used to be such a huge thing. And obviously not as much now that we recognize that not everyone is actually lactose tolerant. But at the time, yeah, milk was a huge thing. And the next major shift that I always note with this happens with Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, of course. All right, let's get in.
Yeah, this is you're getting into like all the stuff that I sit at my desk and I talk about, but I don't get to like put in depth into papers as much.
I love roasting on Margaret Thatcher any chance we can get.
That's 100%. This might be a bit of an aside, but my supervisor found a t-shirt that she had gotten, I think, from Kensington Market in Toronto way back. And she was cleaning out her closet this summer and she came in and she gave me this t-shirt. And it's got a figure, it's got Margaret Thatcher on it and then a mother and like she's like leaning over and like helping tend to her child. And Margaret Thatcher is like pickpocketing out of her purse.
Whoa, good
and
find.
Then underneath it says prevent street crime. So because whenever I'm doing a presentation or something, the one slide I love to put up is of protesters that say Thatcher, Thatcher, the milk snatcher, because as milk was brought in as a requirement, she took it out. That was one of her first things that she did as education minister in an effort to cut back on government funding and government spending.
Interesting.
So yeah, I now have this funny shirt of Margaret Thatcher. That's a very niche shirt that not a lot of people understand now, but I absolutely love. Yeah, so yeah, Margaret Thatcher got rid of milk as a requirement. And then when she actually came into office, she continued to make changes. So one of the big things about the school meal program in the UK is that they couldn't make a profit off of it. You could sell food for kids who needed free meals, they could get free meals, but for other kids, they couldn't make a profit off of that. And she essentially changed that. And so now you can make money off the canteen. And with Margaret Thatcher, often associated with neoliberal practices, this idea of trying to take the state out of social programs and whatnot. And so it's not as, you don't have the state intervening as much. But what we see instead with her cutting funding to the programs is you then have local education authorities, which are kind of in charge of making sure these programs run, is they had to open up the doors to basically caterers who could fight with to get a contract. Yeah. So they were, yeah. And so we still see impacts of this today. There's actually a news article I found when I was doing my research, and it was a principal in Southampton who had like written an open apology letter to all the parents at their school because the food quality at the school was so poor. And it was one of those things, it's a major corporation that's doing the catering, and there's just no food standards there now when it comes to like the quality of food and who's actually checking up on this because it's been so commodified.
Okay,
Yeah,
this makes sense because that was something like when I was reading through the abstracts you sent through, I was noticing that, they had included like electronic paying systems and that you
yeah,
had noted that that had profoundly shifted like how youth were accessing food. So this all makes a little more sense now that it's like less publicly centered and more
yeah.
neoliberal. With those more like technological shifts that have been introduced for students, how is that affecting youth in terms of making their food choices at school?
So I'd say where we see the big impact and where I saw the big impact in speaking with my participants. And while being food insecure was not a requirement to be a part of my project, I had about, I think it was 85 or 87% of my participants were food insecure.
Wow, that's a high
So
rate.
yeah. And a lot of them had eligibility for the free school meal program, which in the UK is based off of whether or not you're utilizing certain income supports or what the total household income is. Still not enough to capture kind of every child that would actually require having access or that would benefit from having access to this. But the main changes that I saw with the electronic pay system had to do with people who were accessing kind of the free school meal program. So what the system used to be prior was that you would get a token and you would exchange this in for a free meal. So you're a part of the program, you got a token, you'd get a full meal that was given to you. There were some issues with this, is stigmatizing. It's a very visible marker that you're food insecure and that you're receiving kind of state-funded food. So that did actually impact uptake of the program because of this kind of the social stigma around it as well. So that was one of the reasons in which they kind of switched over to electronic pay systems, most of which use biomarkers, which is really interesting. That
Okay.
could be a whole
That's a
other
whole other thing.
dissertation.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're often like they'll scan a fingerprint or yeah. So it's really interesting. So like and they'll use that system as well for like their library accounts and stuff like that. So it's this idea, it's all like everything gets centralized to one system. But what it means for students that access the free school meal program is that instead of receiving a full meal, they have a certain amount of money on their account per day. Yeah. And often what they found is that it's not enough. That's what they were telling me, is that they really didn't find that it was enough money for them on the account. It comes down to a lot of them could afford, there's kind of a set meal each day, which is usually set price wise in mind with the fact that there are students with this much money on their account. But you could get this meal and a dessert or this meal and a drink, but you couldn't get all three.
Oh,
Yeah. And then we get into there's all these other compounding variables as well, where we're looking at what's the quality of food, what are the
yeah.
portion sizes like? And there's a lot of complaints about portion sizes and that the food just didn't like it wasn't good, it was cold, it wasn't cooked properly, the chicken was pink,
Oh,
all those
okay.
sorts of things that really make the meal off-putting as well. So that was a kind of a huge issue is that the money they found wasn't kind of enough to stretch across lunch. And the money also really isn't accessible at break times either. And if you use some of the money at break, then you definitely don't have enough money at lunch. So you can buy food at breaks across a couple of I think they've got a morning and an afternoon break usually, and you could get a snack then, but you can't actually access the funds. So they get loaded daily, and usually they're only loaded in time for lunch. A lot of students find. So that's kind of a major issue there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially at a time like physically where, youth are growing so much, their
Yeah.
body demands are quite
Yeah.
heightened in comparison to the rest of us
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah, and it's really hard to listen to like how a lot of them navigate this, especially like if I'd have some participants who didn't have time to eat breakfast at home or didn't have food for breakfast at home, and also a few participants that say I get nauseous when I eat breakfast in the morning, so I don't eat breakfast, which like that's valid as well. But then they get to school And their first meal is then lunch because they don't have money to buy something at break. And if they haven't brought a snack or they don't have a snack to bring, their first meal is lunch. And then they find that lunch isn't enough to actually like satisfy them because that's the first time they're eating in the day. So then they're still kind of hungry afterwards. And there's a lot of conversations about how that just like really brings your mood down. And you leave school at the end of the day and you're ravenous. I think a lot of us have been there where you've accidentally missed a meal for whatever reason, or you've had to miss a meal and you end up really hungry afterwards. And you get home and the first thing that they're reaching for are kind of the snacks, or they're going to get kind of fast food on their way home from school, like things that are cheap, easy, and calorically dense. Also things that we would kind of classify as ultra processed foods. So you're seeing that kind of that impact there, is that it really impacts their eating habits, like not just what they're eating at school, but also kind of later in the day and how they have to think around that. So yeah, it's a lot more than just lunch.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And it strikes me too, in the history that you shared with it and how it connects with even the changes to technology, that this is like this ongoing project of building this idea of like a national body and a national state of health in order to continue growing whatever sort of nation state boundaries you want to address at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit about that as well? Because I know you look at this idea of, what is cultural food in this context.
Yeah,
So can you share a bit about that?
definitely. It was definitely one of those things where when I asked about cultural background, and I think this is one of the things as my positionality that I bring in as a researcher from Canada, growing up in very multicultural communities. I was actually like being white was a minority in my classroom for a number of like growing up. It just there were fewer white people and there were other cultural backgrounds that were in the classroom. So I think that was part of it. I was like people are like, what is their cultural background? How is this impacting what foods they're eating? Are they satisfied with food available at school? And the one thing I really thought I would hear conversations about relating to this was like, there's these ideas about school bullying, that sometimes students experience school bullying when they bring cultural foods from home and other students complain about the smell or that it looks weird or it's different. And so they end up with this kind of bullying, and often ends with students like requesting their parents to get more westernized food, get more American food to put into their lunchbox because they don't want to experience this bullying when they're just trying to eat lunch. So I thought that would be something I would encounter, would be conversations about, I don't see any of my cultural food present at the school canteen. And for a lot, there was discussions of curry, although chicken tikka masala is like one of the UK national dishes, and that is that's a bastardized curry. So curry in the UK, again, a whole other rabbit hole we could fall down. Yeah. But I really wasn't seeing that when I asked a lot of people about what their cultural background was. They would say that they were from the UK or they were from Southampton, UK. And often the participants who were saying that were people that were visibly from a racialized minority or didn't have like that classical British accent, which I thought was really interesting. And it was something I sat with for a really long time. And it was this messiness in my data. And again, thinking about this as like a very messy time that we're looking at. And I was like, I started asking like, why? Why is this the answer that I am consistently getting? And it led me to like a few different kind of hypotheses around it. And one is that they don't want to constantly have their position questioned about, like, it's basically could be seen as asking, do you actually belong here? Which isn't the reasoning behind what I was asking at all. I was really more interested in like what food dishes they enjoy eating, but that could be how they interpreted it, and which is completely valid, especially in the UK where multiculturalism is a little bit more racially loaded, especially. But another thing I came across was just that people that were also answering this, when I asked them what their favorite foods are or what foods they enjoyed eating, I was getting fish and chips, Cornish pasty, beef Wellington, steak and kidney pie, like very classic British foods that I was getting from kind of all participants. Wow. And this was in part what food was available at school, but also what you're seeing a lot in the neighborhood. But in addition to that, they would also mention kind of rice or like chicken and rice or stew, often in relation to like a Nigerian or an African stew. So you kind of saw both there. And so thinking about culture and how do adolescents understand their food cultures, like they all have different food cultures, but this really interesting intersection where it's different than what they were maybe eating or enjoying as a child. And it's also different than what their parents are eating or perhaps making at home, where they're exposed to a little bit more because of what food is available at school. So it's really interesting that like cultural food for them can include what we quote unquote call kind of British food, but also all these other dishes and all these that come from their families and backgrounds as well. And
Yeah.
so it was not something I expected to come out of this field work, dealing with what exactly is a cultural dish? What is cultural
Yeah.
food? Because I then thought about it more and more because I would also have people list pancakes. And how many cultures have different varieties of
Yeah.
pancakes, or pizza? What culture does pizza belong to, right? You've got like an American style pizza, which Italians, if they're very like an Italian chef would very much say that is not a pizza.
Yeah.
So it's and pasta as well, um, like pesto pasta for like someone who grew up eating like traditional kind of British foods like roasts, or salt and pepper are your main season. Pesto might be very exotic for so many of my participants. Like they mentioned pesto pasta as just like something that they ate all the time and something that they enjoyed. And so it's really this idea of like what is a cultural dish, and having to like really, I think it makes it it troubles that definition of what a cultural dish is. But I think it also highlights the fact that different cuisines come together when people do move and like they end up merging and coming up with all these different dishes that kind of come out of that don't fit into any of these neat categories, which I think is also kind of, it's nice to think
Yes,
about as well.
agreed. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's like it's expansive in a way
Mhm.
that I don't tend to see in research. So when I saw that you were really giving this idea of cultural foods a more complex treatment, I was so excited because you're also looking at a population that is exposed to global foods through
Hmm.
TikTok and through other
Yeah.
social media outlets in a way that even our generation
Hmm.
wasn't. Like we
Yeah.
kind of were, but it wasn't the same extent. So I think it's almost like a needed reset of where we go next when we're looking at what dishes have cultural meaning for people and why,
Yeah.
particularly for youth who, as you said, they have so much to say. They have so many observations that really can challenge the status quo of what we're, not only what we're looking at, but also what questions we're asking too.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a couple participants who identified as white British, and one of them during Photo Voice, which allowed them to bring in photos of kind of food that they've made or taken photos of or just enjoyed or their food and environment. And they took a picture of some kimchi that they'd been making. And they were white, but they really loved exploring. Like they were like, there's different variations depending on which region you're in like across the country, and was like really excited about like getting to try to make this. And so, yeah, we do see this kind of globalization of kind of food, especially through social media, advertising. What are they seeing on their way to and from school? And then also just what food tastes good.
Yeah, yeah,
You can have like fish and chips was mentioned so many times in my discussions. And I'm like, yeah, it does
it's
taste
great.
good. It's
It
good.
always
Like,
slaps every single
yeah.
time. 100%. And
Yeah.
it's interesting too because it's, to me at least, and British food is not something that I would say is like my favorite type of cuisine.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found that interesting. Yeah. It was things like Scotch eggs that were coming up. And yeah, things that
Yeah.
I was like, these were not like you go in to interviews and whatnot thinking about what people might say or what dishes they might like be interested in. And those were like Yorkshire pudding. These are just not dishes that you were expecting to hear,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
young people talking about. So yeah, it's interesting to then think, okay, is this stuff that they've been exposed to at school, outside of school, and how like they've built that into what is their unique food culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of like the school meals themselves, are you seeing a reflection of, the diversities of Southampton playing out in what meals are often on the table for this? Or is it, strictly speaking, that kind of blobby school cafeteria food?
This is the one downside of my research. I did it across the summer. So schools weren't running at the time, but it did mean that I was speaking to students all outside of an academic setting, which I think made them a lot more open about sharing negative experiences because I was not associated with any of their schools. But how schools are structured in the UK is also a whole other system. So there's private schools and there's public schools you still have to pay for. And then there's state run schools as well.
Okay.
So the quality of food varies depending on which school you're going to, and like which catering company they have a contract with. So there was definitely a lot of discussions about how it was like it was cold, it was undercooked.
Mm,
Pink chicken again came up a few times. But then there are also people who said that they liked the food at their school. And so that was kind of one thing that because I had such a variety of participants from across the city, and there are so many different school types and schools there. I wasn't able to build kind of a comparison or the ability to contrast like how does food vary between different types of schools.
Yeah, yeah.
But I know that, yeah, there are definitely some that said, oh, like it's fine. It's like your standard fare. It's like, they'll have pasta or like a curry or like some sort of like hot food, and then they'll have like sandwiches, wraps. Sometimes they'd have a salad bar, often tucked away at the back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I often heard about a sad bowl of fruit though. That was
Okay. Did it
like,
happen to have cantaloupe in it by any chance?
I think it was more like apples and oranges, that just don't
Okay.
look like fully ripe.
Yes.
I From what they were describing, it brought up images to me of like if you're ever passing by at an airport kiosk
Yes.
and they have
Yes.
like this bowl of apples or like really underripe oranges, and I'm like, I want fruit, but that is not what I want.
Yeah. And
And
it's
I'm not
always like
paying
$10.
exactly. And that was another thing. I'm like, why am I paying 65p for an apple?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Very fair. So I'm curious in terms of the idea of cultural foods that you're tackling through your research and kind
Yeah.
of how you're framing that in terms of what the youth were putting forward and how you're establishing this idea of cultural foods shifting. How can that be applied into our understandings of public food settings or, research questions that anthropologists are asking?
I think the main one is rethinking what we mean when we ask about cultural background necessarily.
Yeah.
I think that's a big one. And like I was thinking about it coming at it from a place of, are you experiencing like bullying based around food, perhaps? But another one was also like just wanting to understand, get a better like demographic sense. Like, are you a racialized minority? How does this shape your experiences as well? But it's one of those things where like the more and more I kind of was like dealing with that data, and you try to break it down because then you'll have some who are like, well, I'm Indian and I'm British, or I'm Welsh and I'm British, or I'm Scottish and Irish. Like, you've got all these
Uh-huh.
different things, and it's like you can be those things, and you can be white or you cannot be white as well. So it's like, what are we actually getting at when we
Yes.
ask these questions? Which I think is like a really big, like important point to just think about when we're doing research. And I think it's so easy when you're putting together any sort of socio-demographic survey or something to have a question that just asks like, what is your cultural background or what is your ethnic background or how do you identify? And I did leave it as an open-ended question,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting as to why so many answered, I'm from the UK, or even more specifically, I'm from Southampton, UK. Like really
Yeah.
affirming the place in which they were from is that this is like where my culture is and that my culture is kind of built here. So I think that's kind of the first main thing to really think about when you're conducting research in these areas is that, I mean, culture isn't one singularity. It's not one
Totally.
single thing. Like everyone's experience is so different. We generalize to some extent when we're putting together kind of research discussions on this, but keeping in mind that everyone has a different cultural experience, even if they're all living in the same place. And I think from a perspective of food, the one thing I didn't really get a sense of, but would be interesting to know is, okay, so we've got a lot of people that do enjoy British cuisine, but are we actually getting any of that other cuisine available at school? And another like interesting thing that came from that was there was a lot of participants who spoke openly about like utilizing food services like food banks or kind of like food pantries in their neighborhood. And I asked if like they were satisfied with the food options available, if they enjoyed them, and a lot of them said yes. And I wonder how that would change if I'd asked the parents.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, are they okay with this because this fits in to kind of the more kind of westernized dishes that they're used to and that they do enjoy? But how does this fit in then if I ask the parents?
Yeah.
So yeah, thinking about that too is like when someone says that like they enjoy the food from somewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can picture exactly what they're getting. Um,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good distinction. I like that one. Or
yeah.
yeah, even just the idea of like what that cultural nourishment element would be for people as well, like to varying extents of their experiences too.
Yeah. No, and I think that's huge. And that's something that like I talk about a little bit with some of my research is like this notion of healthy food. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of push for improving there's nutritional guidelines in the UK, although whether or not schools are actually meeting these is a whole other question because they're not
Pink
necessarily.
chicken.
Yeah, exactly. Like another one that came up in that news article I mentioned earlier was like an underbaked baked potato, which like that
That's a
bar is
crime.
low. Like that is a low bar.
Yeah.
Um, but it's so like that sense of like the regulations aren't really being followed up on. But there is this push to like make healthy food, but kind of what is healthy food? And do we think about health just from a nutritional standpoint, like this is your meal. Okay, good. You got vitamins, you got fiber, protein, carbs, like healthy fats in there. But if you're sitting down at the end of the day and like just eating this by yourself and you don't enjoy it, you're not getting that social interaction. And I had a participant who like very much brought that up again in one of my photo voice sessions, where she had a picture of a salad that she made with chicken and roasted sweet potato and lettuce and how it was like really healthy and she was trying to be healthy. And then she had a picture of takeaway of like fried chicken and chips that she'd gotten with friends, and just the different expressions, even in like the tone of her voice, and how much more excited she was about this meal that she'd gotten with friends versus this healthy meal. And she spoke about how it sometimes feels like you're eating what people expect you to eat or what like you should be eating when it comes to healthy food, and it's not necessarily the food that you want to eat because it's not nourishing in other aspects. So
Yes.
I think that's a whole other like aspect there when we're thinking about kind of food and food in communities and in like our neighborhoods and what cultural food is that it doesn't necessarily mean that like it's just the dish. It's also what's the environment. I had another example is I had so many participants spoke about how family meals and dinner was like a really key part for them. And how like their family really tried to sit down to eat family meals and how that was like a huge part of the day for them. And again, like, you can have that meal by yourself sitting alone,
Yeah.
but it's a really different experience then.
Really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That joy is very much integral to part of that nutritional experience as well. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me to chat about your research. It is so fascinating and such a pleasure to like see where you're at now. Do you mind sharing with folks where they can find you and your work online if they want to learn more?
Yeah, for sure. I don't have a huge online presence. One of those things where I'm like, I should start a blog, you know, or I should start some sort of page where I'm posting things.
Yes.
And I should, but it's also just been so busy with
Fair.
research that maintenance of that has not ever taken priority. So right now, if they want to find me online, they can honestly, so far all of my papers that I'm first author on are all open access, and that's something I kind of
Awesome.
aim for. So if they want to find any of those are fully available online. I also like, I'm always happy to answer questions via email as well. So my email is my last name, Oresnik with an S at McMaster.ca. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm always happy to chat more about this.
Awesome.
Yeah. And one of these days I will get around to getting a blog up.
I'm going to
And
bug you until you do.
I know you are. I know you are.
Because it'd be great.
I know. And it's one of those things where I'm like, I have all these thoughts that like don't belong in an academic paper, but it's just me making sure I actually like have time to manage it and it doesn't just collect dust in the internet somewhere.
Totally. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I'll have it all in the show notes for people to check out your papers as
Okay.
well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
Anytime. That was Sarah Resnick. I've linked their resources in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help get the word out. For more Anthodish, sign up for my newsletter at sarahdougnan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.